Welcome, fellow beekeepers. This is Jamie Walters, OSBA's Maumee Valley Director and News Editor. I'm pleased to announce OSBA's new live webinar training series. Live sessions are recorded on the second and fourth Sunday of each month, 7 p.m. through Zoom conference call. You're welcome to attend by making a reservation on OSBA's website at www.ohiostatebeekeepers.org. Go to the events page and scroll down to the event you would like to attend. Confirm your RSVP by filling out the registration form with your city, state, name, and email address. Approximately 2 hours before the beginning of Sunday's webinar, an active Zoom link will be sent to your email address. Each training session will be recorded and posted on the following Sunday on OSBA's new YouTube channel. You can find it at Ohio State Beekeepers Association. You're welcome to subscribe and be sure to click the bell to be alerted each time we upload a new video. Each month's speakers and presentation will be posted on the Facebook page, by direct email to registered and paid members, and our website at ohiostatebeekeepers.org. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at editor@ohiostatebeekeepers.org. And now on to our previous recorded webinar.
I'm going to ramble here just a little bit. I've got this tickly throat going on, so I'm going to hope that I'm going to talk my way through that as we get other people a chance to log on here for the first minute or two. So bear with me if you can. So in that vein, Jamie had already said this, but let me do that. Nobody thanks the thank youer. I'd like to thank OSBA for hosting this relatively new format. Just interesting times that we live in, and we look for positive notes. And I've got to say that these Zoom meetings really seem to be something. It literally is. They're not the same. I dearly love chatting and meeting old friends and colleagues across the plains, but this is what we got to do, and we seem to be getting a different group. So I want to begin also by thanking, in particularly OSBA, but individuals. I mentioned earlier that people make organizations, they have names, they have faces. So a special shout out and a thank you to Peggy Garn for being kind of a banner carrier for this program. And Jamie Walters back there, who's gonna try to hide obscurity, but not without his technical expertise in pulling this all together. And it takes a lot of time and energy to do this. My hat's off, Jamie. Thank you very much for this. And one last thank you to the general audience still coming on and participating, taking time away from your evenings and so forth. It shouldn't go without saying. A lot of people are still chiming in, so let me continue my ramble. When I was asked to do this, a speaker always has a challenge. How deep to go into a topic. And mine in particular, when somebody gave me a holler about this several months ago, what do you do with a topic is broad and is generalized as the summer dearth. This isn't like, I'm not trying to make light of it, but it's not like making a split or a nuke or, how does one do artificial insemination or something. This is a generalized topic. So you kind of get stuck in the weeds where, do I talk a little bit about a lot or a lot about a little? And I've used this one before, but for this general, and to try to give the either viewer or listener a heads up so you can run in the opposite direction right now, this is a generalized chat. Time before the summer really sets in to kind of talk about some of those things that are coming on that will affect our beekeeping for us, and what we can do to help mitigate some of those issues that will arise. So, but given the fact that we have such a generalized audience, it's important that, this is going to be under a lot of you, over some of you, and I have to try to find a sweet spot in there. So at the end of all this, the contact information will be left. If I really encourage some questions at the end if I can. I'm going to try to race through a few things because I think the dynamics of this can propel, and we'll leave it to Jamie to pull out a few tidbits from here, because I really want to know what you want to know. So, and use the energy of that, so it isn't just a talk. So, for no further ado, I think we'll get started, because we are going to run out of time before we know it. And so I call this the summer dearth or summer death. I chose these two frames in the center because we kind of start on the left and we end up on the right, many of us. Summer full of brood, full of opportunity, lots of nutrition, lots of bees, and then somehow by the end of summer we kind of get to the frame on the right. And there are reasons for that, and I hope that we can get through them. Oh, by the way, one last little note. I'm going to disappear here for a moment because I personally just kind of find it distracting to see myself staring at myself for these. So I'm going to come back at the end of this. But I hope I didn't lose anybody. Still there, Jamie? We're good?
Yes, sir.
Great. So let's begin. Hopefully. So Jamie already gave me an introduction. I work out of Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Its claim to fame is that this is the birthplace of the modern beehive in the 1850s. Lorenzo Langstroth spent the better part of a decade and a half here. And I'm always asked, and yes, about every couple of months when I'm in just the right mood, I get a chance to go back to the Langstroth cottage and sit for an evening and wonder how he wondered that got us to where we are now. Other quick takeaways, I kind of run bees and some experiments from northern Wisconsin down to Sarasota, Florida. So I get a chance to have several seasons, if you will, put a couple of bee seasons into one, trying to take advantage of a longer season, a stretch season. Actually, we're beginning some work down in South America now, so taking advantage of the hemispheres so that if we get some particular genetic experiment running and we want to keep it going, we don't have to wait for next year. We can kind of go around the clock, if you will, which isn't as easy as you think, given the strict laws that prohibit actual bee transportation to various countries, let alone the times in which we live now. So my interests cover general bee health, queen breeding through selection and artificial insemination, and spending a good deal of time trying to find out how we can make soybean farmers, soybean hybrids, and nutrition that comes during the summer dearth, take that away. We have Ohio, for some of you out there. Northern Ohio has different rainfall, different conditions, and different soybean hybrids. And therefore, they actually take a much bigger nectar crop than we do in the southern part of the state. But if we could convince soybean farmers and the right hybrids of soybeans that we're kind of good for all locations, this would solve part of our summer dearth problem, and I'll get into that in just a moment. Just a little moment on here. So I'm going to be throwing out a couple of these little tongue-in-cheek remarks. I recently had a health issue that made me get a little philosophical. I think that happens when you stare at a ceiling for a little while. And so some of them, and this has to do with, I'm calling it the COVID metaphor. We have to be realistic in sizing up what we're doing. I make an argument here that we're dealing with a virus from the general public. We in the beekeeping community have been in this boat for about 27 years now, where we've been dealing with pests and diseases, and particularly viral expression now that's been causing some real problems. So, there's an overlay. You'll probably sense it in what's going on here. So basically, I'm going to try to define a little bit for some what the summer dearth really is. It comes as a surprise to some, what the effects are on bees and beekeepers, and some of the things that we can potentially do to interceding and mitigating some of the issues that come up, and make your beekeeping experience a lot better. So let's begin. Ohio is one of those wonderful states. You know, you look around. I just got done coming back up from Florida, and you've got this lack of a better term, great green expanse. and you feel like you're basically in the Garden of Eden here. Everything looks lush, plentiful, great. But I caution, don't be fooled. Because when you look across these great green expanses, as lovely as they are, as profitable, as economically as they are actually, from a bee's eye or a beekeeper's perspective, very much like this. Whether you like it or not, this is where we're putting our beehives. Come the summer, once we get through the local wild or feral floral blooms, we're left to the agra crops and agribusinesses to kind of sustain us and get us through the summer. And for the most part, corn and soybeans just aren't going to do it. One of the things I also want to give is a little bit of a perspective to some of the newer and moderate beekeepers, at least share a little bit of how I look at the world when I break it down into parts and pieces. And if you're a physicist or an engineer, you're going to love this. But I kind of look at things as a stimulus response, or what we call forcing functions. And one of them is just the way this is beekeeping in its simplest form. How does beekeeping fit into the natural world that we live in today? And I've identified where we are in July on here now, but the top curves are basically forcing down on us, all of us, including our bees, which then in turn really translates into how our flora respond. The nectar that we did or didn't get this year, and there are a lot of sad stories out there. And wedged in between that are our bees. So we have this world that we live in. We have to go to work, we get educated, we have to earn a living, and then one thing begets another, families, and so forth. Well, our bees are very much like this in their world, with the fact that they're constricted by the things that are happening around them. One of the things that surprises in that floral curve many beekeepers is that, believe it or not, conditions have to be just right. You have to have enough bees in the box, you have to have enough nectar coming in order for them to bring in either the needed or the surplus honey for that year. And even though there are 365 days in a year, you have about 30 golden days, just 30, where conditions are just right, where you can bring in the majority of that honey crop that hive may have to use to sustain itself for the huge year. The takeaway from that is, let's go backwards. What happens if you just get 1 week of rain or 1 week of cold where the bees can't fly? Out of that 30 days, all of a sudden your crop is hit by 20%, 25%. And that can make a significant difference on the type of honey crop this year. And I'd love to know. I've heard great stories. I've heard horror stories this year. We'll see. But things are rapidly coming to an end for almost everybody across Ohio. And you've probably seen this one, many of you. But the fact of the matter is, it's important just to remind ourselves of the numbers again. It's an occupational hazard for me. But the fact of the matter is, a typical honeybee colony in Ohio burns through about 100 pounds of honey a year just for themselves. So that's 100 pounds of honey. But when you translate that into flower sources, and why I'm focusing on floral and soybeans, is many people are familiar that it takes about 2 million flower sets to make just that 1 pound of honey, 2 million. So to give us that 200 pounds, 100 for them, 100 for you, we start talking in the hundreds of millions. And then one of the mistakes that's commonly made in Ohio is that things are working out well. I've gotten through my learning curve. Everything seems to be going fine. So let's scale up a little bit. And the next thing you know, and with swarming, I have 1 colony, I have 2, I have 4, I have 10. And the next thing you know, somebody is tapping you on the shoulder saying, do you have 4 billion flowers in that roughly 2-mile radius flying arc that the bees are going to be in? And that's a tough call for many of us here. And the answer is no for many of us here. So we've had to stagger our yards, and they've changed over the years. I will say there's a fun little joke amongst beekeepers that unfortunately when a beekeeper passes and everybody's showing up for equipment and other things and passing the torch on, there are a few people in the back room that keeps looking for that sacred treasure map. A beekeeper who's been at it for a while knows where the secret spots are in Ohio, where you've got the right soybeans over here, some alfalfa over there, you've got water sources over here, and then you have some indigenous floral crop over there. That's just to show you how important that is, especially here in Ohio, with so much of our land being dedicated to block crop farming. Things have changed. This is not the Ohio of your parents, your grandparents, or your great-grandparents. So back to our curve again, a lot of people, I always look at this backwards. In other words, wondering why populations are the way they are, you suddenly come to realize bees just don't go helter-skelter. They're literally grown, and that population grows in a very constricted. They're masters of their own universe or their own fate. The light and rainfalls and heat from above push the flowers from below, who then in turn push our bee populations. And it's really important to recognize that, our bees are being pushed into this particular shape and curve. And that gives you the opportunity, and I'll plant the seed for just a moment. If nature can push our bees, the great question then is, can you? Can you change any of these opportunities in here to push your bees and change the arc of those curves? And of course, the answer is yes. And the great challenge is how and when. So one of the other frustrating things that comes now that summer is here is that when does all of this occur? And everybody wants to know when. I mean, is the honey flow in? Should I start extracting now? Am I going to expect a little more? Well, there's so much variability in here, and summer dearth plays into this, and it makes it really kind of confounding and frustrating, is that we have a seasonal variability. Not only do things juggle season a week and a half plus or minus from a mean every year, so things aren't quite on track. That vacation that you planned, boom, I have to be in the condo down in the islands, or I'm running up north to see some folks, but I got to get this done. Well, the weather that year may play a different role. And not only does it adjust left and right by a couple of weeks, but in terms of the amplitude, it literally, a good year, bad year. If you deal with a lot of commercial beekeepers, you'll find out that a surprise to many sideliners or small beekeepers is that honey flows on a year-by-year basis in Ohio can literally, instead of saying, we're within 5, 7, 10% of our yearly mean. Here in Ohio, if you talk to enough beekeepers, you will literally see, not just you, but many of the commercial beekeepers will literally see their honey harvests change by as much as 45 to 60%. And that's a tough thing for those economists in the room to try to plan for. You better have some money in the bank for next year. You could have a bad year or three, and things could really change on you. So let me just kind of pull back for a moment and talk about some of the general dearth effects that are hitting us. And many of these are common sense. That's beekeeping. The first thing that really impacts us is that the nectar and the pollen all but cease. And when I say cease, the metaphor that most people use, it feels just like a water tap. It literally was on yesterday and it's gone today. It's not kind of, it doesn't peter out, it's gone. And part of that's our bees. There has to be significant forage out there for them to go at scale. They just don't waste energy on a onesie, twosie kind of thing. That in turn, with the lack of feed or stimulus coming in, our populations start to drop. But before that, an insidious little problem occurs is that we've got all these kids in the house, and then all of a sudden the food supply ends. And I don't know why. I said I've got this brooding COVID economy cloud hanging over my shoulder. But I can well imagine that when a large part of the country saw a 30 to 40 million people unemployed all of a sudden, just like that, it becomes personal when, what do I do? Where do I go? How do I feed my family? How does this happen? Well, this happens in beehives. Suddenly, overnight, the nectar flows stop. I'm at peak population. What do I do? And that starts putting a stress. The pollen is blown through, the nectar stores start going quickly, and then a natural thing happens, which is they start holding back on feeding and stimulating the queen, which then slows down her egg laying. And it has to. You can't arrive at winter in Ohio with 150,000 bees in a box unless you have incredible storage capacities. There has to be a natural thing in there. Another thing that really happens, and again, common sense, is when the rains cease and so forth, the humidity goes down. And it's very important. Many of us sitting in our homes, comfortable, don't realize that those boxes, those dark black boxes, have to stay at about 70 plus or minus % humidity in order for larvae to develop properly. And that takes a lot of water. Once the air humidity drops precipitously, it takes a lot of water flights. We'll talk about that later on, what we can do to help mitigate that. But then another issue that people have to realize as we go through the summer dearth, because it's a process, is that summer bees just are aging in place. They've been working hard, they've been foraging for nectar, now they're foraging for water, and the typical lifespan of the summer honeybees is about 6 weeks, as opposed to the fall winter bees, which is about 6 months. And it literally is an energy burn, and the candle that burns twice as bright burns half as long thing. So just recognize that these things are going on. And then finally, it's something we'll talk a little bit more about, is this is the insidious pests and diseases. The world that we live in just doesn't involve light and rain in floral, but pests and diseases are always out there. They're part of their world, but the summer dearth accelerates their growth. And that's what gets us into this next problem. It would be one thing if we just let the colonies kind of, okay, so a lot of nectar is coming in, mom and dad, we tighten our belts. I'm sorry, we're going to have to run the family car for another year or 3, and we'll make do. It would be enough, and we see those bee curves twist and bend, showing us that that's what they do. But the villains enter at this particular point, which it's kind of a double down. As the bees are starting to weaken a little bit, a whole host of things start to emerge. And that is, these are scaled by size in terms of how they impinge our bees, but varroa mites with their now associated pathogens, bacterial and viral, and a whole host of other things out there, nutritional aspects, pesticides, environmental poisonings, etc. All of these things are milling around as our bees are flying through this and working in this space. And then an interesting one comes along. And now that there are so many beekeepers in this space and working, we've got other things that we've recognized. Queens have become more and more of a problem. Miticides themselves, aimed to help, in many cases, are also hurting, though we need to use them. Genetics is playing a bigger role than it used to. Quite succinctly, we just need better bees. We need healthier bees. We need bees that can withstand some of the, if we can't change the environments per se, maybe one solution is that we change the bees that are hardier. They can withstand greater shocks that the environment is giving them. And then boldly, sadly, I put the biggest hex on here. I think that's about proportional. We in Ohio in particular here are still losing about 50+% of our bees year over year. And one of the primary culprits for that is, yes, lurking behind the scenes, as you can see here, are the gitches and the bugaboos. But in the front is us beekeepers. More of us are getting into the field, the craft. As we do that, it takes a while to develop that learning curve. And that's what these programs are intended to do. Good news behind that, I mean, I hate to put it this way, but that big curve is another pest, and that happens to be us. We are a pest of the hives. If we're not helping them, we're hurting them. And one of the good news about that is, one of the great things is, even with that 50+% mortality that I'm alluding to right now, if you look at commercial operations that don't suffer these kinds of losses and what they do to mitigate this, it turns out that if with a little bit of learning, these kinds of classes, etc., we too could probably see that curve bend all the way down. I mean, I think that aggressively we could get to about 7 to 9% mortality given the current state of bees, certainly well within a 12 to 15%, I think. But 50% plus, we can do better than that, and I have every confidence that we will. One of the things, lastly, just about this, is that when people start getting a little frustrated with this, well, I'm just going to do this and then I'm going to do that and this should work for me, and they're finding out that even at home, your home alchemist and experimentations aren't working quite the way you thought. That's our problem. This whole thing is moving. So just about the time we think we've got something nailed to the floor, something intercedes, something interacts, something works on something else, and before you know it, it's a complex thing. And this gets me back to my COVID shroud. Wouldn't it be nice, with all we know, split the atom, land on the moon, going to Mars, starships, electric cars, this type of technology working? Certainly, it's been a long time since Salk came up with the polio vaccine. We can cure this, right? Well, if it were that easy. Given enough time, I think we're intelligent enough and creative enough, but it's complex. It's inherently complex. But again, I said this earlier with a smile, I am one of those people, I'm neither a glass half empty nor a glass half full. I just start with the glass not being big enough kind of guy, and I think we have to approach beekeeping from that perspective. We've got some real challenges out there yet. I'm very optimistic that we can face these challenges, but it's going to take work and time. I hope that. One of the things I also think that affects many of us, my hands are in the air on this one, is we people tend to think linear. We think in terms of lines. Something went up, interest rates are this way, or I did something and then I did a little bit more and then maybe a little bit more, and I think in terms of a line. And many operators in the biological world don't work that way. They work on not a linear line, but they work on geometric or exponential curves. And it's hard to assess what that means, but it's a doubling, essentially. Diseases and pests, you go into your colony, you look in your logbook, you did a mite check, maybe you had a less than 3% mite load, you go away for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you kind of come back, you get around to kicking the box again, and all of a sudden, boom, you're at 9, 10, 12, 15% mite load, and you wonder, what? And part of that is our misunderstanding on how these things work. A good example would be here, back to my soybeans. If we look at our bees like we look at these soybean fields from the road, everything looks fine. And if we take a step closer, it would take a real eagle eye to begin to notice anything really different. But then when you start to look even closer, all of a sudden, if these weren't mites starting to show up, when just about here you went on your little hiatus, and then you came back to find yourself literally in a riddled field of soybeans or your hive, it's because these things grow at an exponential rate, not at a linear rate. And that catches us by surprise. We're just not used to thinking linearly. And these can really just come back to bite us. And we just got to keep that in mind as we progress through the summer. It's very hard because it's counterintuitive. So with some of this said, what can we do? What works? And I'm hoping to get to that, but I also want to get through this. Here's one small deep breath. At about right now, usually if I'm sitting in the room, my heart's racing, my blood pressure's up, I'm going, oh my God, I think I'm going to take up basket weaving instead. It'll be calmer for my nerves. Most of beekeeping is repeatable. It's a kind of a wash, rinse, repeat thing. It's in the nuances that we get into trouble. So the good news is you don't have to reinvent your beekeeping craft every year. Most of it, and far more than 90%, is repeatable, but the devil is in the details. And one other good way to put this is Here's the optimism of that. What's so fascinating about bees that is, I can say stimulus response, I can say if then, but literally if you do this or your bees do this, then something happens almost mathematically. It literally, it's like flipping a coin. If you do this, then they do that. And my favorite example is to literally look at bees and bee space that Langstroth here discovered in the 1850s. And many of you will recognize this as bees bridging, stimulating their wax glands. Because all I did, and I wish I would have put the date on here, this actually happened at the end of December on a sunny day. I literally thought, and I knew it in the summertime, but what if I went out on a warm day in Ohio and I pulled a brood frame out and I pulled the frames apart? And would they actually, I mean, are they that programmable? Would they literally start bridging even in the middle of winter when they don't typically build wax? Would they do this? And the answer was yes. They can't help themselves. And that gives you some insight in terms of their behavior and how they think and don't think. One of the other big issues that I'm constantly perplexed by is, and this gets me back to the COVID shroud again, why bother? I mean, if bees are natural to the world, just let them do their thing. Maybe our interventions are the problem. Maybe we're creating weakened bees, and that can be an issue for them, for us. Well, it turns out not so. Again, our bees are much simpler. They're not vacillating, philosophizing, thinking about, boy, I wonder, he gave me a glass of milk. Is he going to bring me a cookie? They're literally just reacting to their environment. So from a beekeeper's perspective, all the motivating factors, given the high mortality rate we have here in Ohio, are at your disposal, because literally you have so much. It's kind of like dieting and exercise. These are all painful, negative reinforcing things. But if you can come up with positive things on the outside, we're more likely to stick to them. And this list is just kind of a short example, including some of those. I think one person many years ago when I presented a similar slide said to me, you know what I love most about this was that the because you can expression. You do it because you can. And I got that. On the other side, as we've proven in Ohio in particular, there's a high cost for not interacting with your bees during the summer, for getting on top of them. Okay, we've gotten the honey crop, thank you very much. But now their hard work begins for them. The easy stuff was there. Anybody can make hay while the sun shines. But now that things are getting tougher, it really is up to us. And another positive note on that is that we've now, as through these webinars will demonstrate, we've learned so much. We've got so many tips, tricks, and techniques for moving things along that you know, pretty soon this is all going to be our own Google Cloud. You know, where you just get to ask a question and you'll get a responsible answer. But here's a classic one for me, and it drives us. This is a classic bee yard that you'll find out there. One hive just seems to be doing fantastic. One hive is doing poorly. There's a lot of moderating bees, but then in steps the beekeeper. And this is kind of the essence of beekeeping. You could leave this alone, you could let it be, or you can intercede. And this is a shot I just like to show that this was purposeful. We literally concentrated on genetics, a specific yard. The year helped play a really good role. We had nectar flows that just came and didn't look back. But by early stimulative feeding, by nutritional feeding, we were able, and hive management for swarming and so forth, we were able to literally prove that you can take yards like this. We were working for a project under a commercial operator who literally was looking for honey as their main product, and proved that if you followed a recipe, if you followed a methodology, you could arrive at this. And for those of you who are curious, our average across these yards that year was 287 pounds of honey per colony. And that's right here in the southwest of Ohio, not in some far away Unicorn Valley with everything working in the wind to your back. So there's a lot of positives there. But but then we have to come back, and I'm kind of switching back and forth between not trying to beat you up with negatives. Is one of the best definitions I think over the years that I come up with, because everybody, you're a beekeeper, you do beekeeping. What does that mean, really? And it used to mean something, but now today more than ever, it means that we're a stress reducer. We literally look around our colonies to try to see what's impinging on them or impacting them. And our job is to see that, to monitor for that, and then to alleviate that as best we can. So summer comes along, the summer dearth comes along, and we start with the obvious. We start with a lot of heat and or a lack of rain. And then that creates other issues, food shortages. In particular, everybody thinks honey, but it's so important that we can't keep our eyes on the ball for pollen. When we're still raising drones are pollen fiends. And it's so important, and I'll get to this in a moment, but this nutritional aspect that we lose, not only from keeping larvae moist so that we can literally lay and hatch new bees, but once we begin down this insidious path, we literally get to a point where it's difficult for the bees to come back from. Our populations start to plummet in response, and there are things, again, that we can do this. So to get some kind of a feel for this, though, where does it all start? I mean, you've got to know where your bees. Some of you, I mean, are already shaking your heads. I appreciate that. I've been in those colonies. They just seem to do fine by themselves, and they don't need our help at all. But the vast majority of colonies do need a little kickstart, a little something. Just like you have colonies that bring in a lot of honey or colonies that bring in a lot of pollen. They don't do that all across the board. So you've got to literally monitor, and that's such a big word for me. You've got to monitor what's going on in your colonies in order to get a start. You don't know where you are. You don't know if you need to do something. And I want to define that. For me, monitoring it's a little bit of a catchy phrase, but it's what to look for, when to look, what to do about what you find, actually do it, and then this last most important part that so many of us have been leaving behind, verify that what you're doing works. A lot of us kind of work through this stair-step process, and then we kind of leave that trailing one off. I put in my miticide strips. I did the thing you're talking about, so I'm fine, right? Well, maybe not. The world's a little more complex in that hive. Your bees may have seen these archicides, these miticides that we have, and they're not effective. And the same with your mites. So you've got to prove that what it is you're doing is working, and working for that colony. There's a lot going on in there. So with that said, and I throw monitoring in here, here's that slide that always makes everybody run screaming into the dark. It's that how often do I get in? What do you do? And so I've kind of broken this up into three major parts. One is hive manipulations. The red curves basically are the littlest things you can do. I mean, if you did nothing else, you have to start with red. And that is, we take mouse guards on and off, winter wraps on and off if you use them. We maybe swap brood chambers to reduce swarming. And then we super up, we extract honey, super down, and we've got the flip side of that. But in between that, we have opportunities. And that's what the summer dearth is really calling for. Yesteryear, we didn't do a lot of these, the feeding and the monitoring. But those were yesteryear's bees, not today's bees. And they're not the same by any stretch. So you've got to, into your beekeeping program, you've got to incorporate not just step 1, but steps 2 and 3. And again, I can't get too depthy here. It's a little about a lot. So I beg your pardon on that. One of the things I want to address in terms of things that we can do through the summer is don't let time be your enemy. It doesn't take long to do a monitoring. We call them fire drills. Pop the top off, get to the brood chamber, pull the center frame, take a look at it. Almost 99% of the colonies out there will tell you in that snapshot of what it is that's happening in there. You'll get a feel for it, queen right, egg laying, viability, disease presence. You're going to see it more than likely there. Let me end on that one by saying one of the things that I've been doing a lot lately, just to even speed things along in certain cases, is we all have tech on us. Most of us have a phone, a camera on us. If you're really moving fast, really quick, and you want a deeper dive, lay that frame on its side, take a snapshot of each side, and then tuck it back away and get to it later at your own leisure. Stop time, literally, and then view in depth later on. It's fascinating. You'll see a lot more at home in the leisure of your cave than you're going to see out there in the field when everything is kind of impinging on you, the heat, the sun, the bees, the whatnot. You'll find it a very enjoyable experience. So give that a shot if you can. Some other quick mitigations before we get to, I'm trying to close this off for some Q&A. I actually pulled these shots just the other day. I said heat and water were two of the biggest culprits that are byproducts of the summer dearth. And I just can't say enough about heat. Almost all of us have gotten used to talking about insulating our colonies for the winter. And there are a lot of people who do that. We're on that edge. A lot of people just south of us don't do it. Almost everybody north of us does do it. They see the advantages of it. But here's a clear example in ours. One on the right-hand side was a tin top, and the other one was a copper top. And this literally was from yesterday. Take a look at the temperatures that were radiating off the top of those hives. And by the way, just for fun, it was only 87 degrees at the time that I took these shots. So think about that temperature impacting those colonies. From the side of those boxes, I was getting the woodenware was actually showing a temperature of 120 degrees facing the sun side of that. So a couple of things, and not to beat this to death, but think about this. This is a styrofoam hive on your left. Look at it's not 120 degrees. On this particular day when that was taken, I remember we were in I think it was 93 degrees, 93, 95. We were almost, it would have been 95, ambient. But over here, when I first put this on this side, which was 120 degrees, all I did was I took a piece of aluminum foil. So here you go. This is your moneymaker right here. Everybody has aluminum foil at home. Don't wrap your hives in the summer. You'll over-insulate them. You'll cook them. What you want to do is radiate the heat off of them, not insulate the heat into them. So simply take on the sunny side of your colonies aluminum foil. You can use something as complex as windshield reflectors that you can pick up for $1 and change out there, and they work really well. And just place them on the sunny side of your colony. But again, you will be amazed at how much stress you relieve on a colony in terms of water flights, in terms of internal heat, when they don't have to cook inside that box. And for those of you who have captured too big of a swarm and put them in too small of a box, or have seen this is something that compounds over time. And it's really quite amazing. And again, to stop and think that you can think of the number of water flights that are going to happen between now and say September. So think of the amount of heat on that box, the number of tens of thousands of miles those bees are going to have to fly, and the water that they're going to have to bring in to cool that colony. And if you could mitigate that by removing 20, 30, 40 degrees temperature from them, you're going to have a healthier hive. You're going to have more resources that haven't been eaten up, and you're going to have bees that aren't burning themselves out as we get into the fall. Something as simple as hive radiation in the summer, not insulation in the winter. And we just don't see very much of that happening out there. And I think that's going to be something that we're going to see a lot more of, and that's hence the summer dearth project. Another one that relates to heat and then the lack of rain is water. And one of the things that we've been doing a lot more too is, some of you are lucky. You happen to have this beautiful valley. Unicorns are prancing around there. Rainbows are glistening off of the pond. And there's your water source, and the bees just have to go there. I'm suggesting that one of the things beekeepers can do is not just feed as we do for winter, spring into summer, and fall into winter feeding, but summer feeding in particular. Try this, and that is give them what they want. They respond well to water if you put just water in a colony. You have to be careful there that you put something in it so that if the water hangs around long enough, in that heat, it's not going to mold or something. And one of the ways we like doing this is let's give them essentially a nectar alternative. Most nectars that bees collect in Ohio, the floral sources range in about 10 to 15% sugar concentrations. So if you literally only put a very mild concentration, you do two things. The sugar is going to keep mold from growing as fast in the water containers. But if you put those feeders literally inside the colony, those bees are able to feed 24/7, and they're able to take that water in, literally saving that colony hundreds and hundreds of thousands of flights and tens and tens and tens of thousands of miles to bring that in. And at the same time, if it's not just water, but a light sugar concentration mimicking a nectar flow, they don't know the difference. Nobody's saying, well, thanks for the feeder. They're literally saying, hey, is there a nectar flow going on out there? And you'll find yourself surprised because you'll see an uptick in brood production. You'll see wetter brood. You'll literally see the bees acting as though they're still in the stage. You can make wax and draw wax. You can do a host of other things, particularly if you're pushing your queen and queen rearings later into the season. If you're giving them what they want, what they need, when they need it, back to stimulus and response, your bees are going to act accordingly and give you what you want. So one other big one that comes for the summer that really, by the time our queens get through the big brood rearing season, some of these queens are exhausted, and they're literally petering out, or they're going to die. But you're past that early supersedure queen rearing stage. Back to monitoring again. Monitor your brood production, monitor your queens. Just because these there, we've got to start literally doing a lot more. Like most people, when we talk about monitoring, they'll look for honey. A lot of people are used to that, but they don't look for pollen. Or they'll look for brood to see if it's there, but how much brood? What's the quality quantity? And then, of course, once you start seeing a haphazard brood pattern, that can lead us into a phase where a whole set of other things can be happening that isn't necessarily good for your colony, and is a spiral down that's not going to get you where you want to go. So accept the fact that this is going to happen. Typically on the top, we're expecting this to happen. But when you monitor, if you see the lower curve happening, literally there seems to be a higher mortality. This is something, again, that you want to get on sooner rather than later. And again, my good example of this is, imagine this B curve in July already starting to show the beginning of the signs of a problem. Well, it's going to take you a while to recognize it, then mitigate it. But let's just play a game together. What if an egg is laid today? That egg is going to hatch 21 days from now. So to be a full-fledged forager, 14 to 17 days after hatching, we've got a month and a half, a month and 3/4 behind us before we have an active foraging water carrier or nectar gatherer. And already think about July. If we're going to get through to fall, things that are going to make us healthy in the fall have to be done now. And that's where a lot of our hives begin our problems. And why I actually was interested in doing the Summer Dearth project is because too often we talk about the fall problems in the fall and the winter problems in the winter, when there's little or nothing we can do about that. This is the prime time. You have a golden month to 2 months in here where you can literally make some truly effective changes for health and vigor in your colonies that will literally pay back in spades come just early fall, the fall flow, building your colonies up. Another way of saying that is just pretend for a moment that you're back in January, February, and instead of building up for that late March, April into May summer flow, now you're building your bees for health and population specifically for the fall flow. Do what you need now to help them, just like you did back in the beginning of the spring, and you'll see amazing results in terms of hive health and hive productivity when you get there. I'm trying to keep an eye on time here. How are we doing, Jamie? Are we in the ballpark?
Yep, you're doing well.
Okay. One of the things to recognize as we talk about, one of the things I like about feeding is notice how the different ages and stages of bees, this is a classic chart by Randy Oliver that shows us what typically happens in a colony. This is something you can look at your leisure. I'm trying to convince you as a beekeeper that if you step in here, as you can see these curves plummeting, we're at peak, and that was over where he is. Imagine in Ohio, these curves are shifted a little bit to the left, but notice how precipitously they plunge in terms of the age and the number of bees you have if you leave them alone. I'm saying that you can change that. I'm saying that if you put in water feeding, not only to save a lot of time, energy, and bee lives, but you do it as a stimulus, a feeding stimulus, you can bump up these curves, and you can create a situation that can work for you, the beekeeper, for health and hive production come the fall, but it's going to take that. So one of the other characteristics that I want to be careful about is this is a classic bee curve that shows up in many books, and this is what was classic. I think for the most part we saw this, but then somewhere along the line bees changed, mites changed, and so I want to be careful that this isn't cemented in your mind that, you know, I just got done with my or not quite done with my honey extraction, so I don't have to worry about pests just yet. Let me, you know, get to that after the extraction. Be careful with that. A lot of work that we do now, we start monitoring literally to develop at least a baseline, so that we know if our mites are increasing, holding the same, or falling. We'll begin monitoring on nice, sunny, bright, unseasonably warm days the end of February, because it gives us at least a start. Some colonies come through the winter with mites or mite loaded. Some mites are incredibly insidious and take off again non-linearly, but geometrically. And so you have no choice here. Rather than guessing or relying on curves, monitoring is this. It's kind of like the Swiss Army knife of beekeepers' tools. It's a one-stop shopping. Monitoring just basically says, stop all the nonsense. Don't turn on the radio or TV or the whatnot to see what the weather's like outside. Step outside, see what the weather's like outside. And monitoring literally has to be hive by hive. That's the inter-hive variability. You've got to find out what that colony is doing in your yard today so that you can make real assessments about what's going on here. One of the things that's interesting here, I want to just throw out there, everybody's arguing this will cause a Hatfield and McCoy squabble like nobody's business, but we're starting to even lower that threshold, and that is by the time you start to see 3%, it used to be 7%, then it was 5%. But by the time we see even a 3% threshold from a mite, whether you're doing an alcohol wash or a sugar shake or something like that, we're already becoming nervous. Because at the very least, even at those levels, we're starting to see real effects on honey production, starting to see some beginnings of health. But it's also been the insidious nature. In the beginning, those thresholds had to do with how much feasting on the bees' bodies could they take with a certain number of mites in the colony. Now that mites basically are the vector for pathogens, bacterial and viral, we want to keep those thresholds even lower, because more often than not in our colonies today, it's not just the mite count that's killing our colonies, it's the disease count that's killing us. And again, I just want to say that bacteria and viruses exponentially grow. And so when they get inside of our bees' bodies, it's basically, one researcher put it this way, it's basically like they're being shot with gut shot from inside. The damage just becomes just precipitous in a very small amount of time. So again, it's my COVID threshold shroud here is, and I don't mean to be political here, but wearing a mask, as an example, is a protection for the other guy, not necessarily for you. And here, keeping our thresholds down, you're protecting your other colonies, because these bees have the ability through drones and other flights to rapidly spread these kinds of things that are going on. So I'm going to quickly get through here. One mindset for people in that summer dearth is that Ohio itself, I tend to think of it in terms of two different seasons, the spring into summer and then the summer into fall. And I kind of react differently because there are things that I do in the spring for hive health and bee checks that I don't do in the middle of the summer and vice versa. So we really do kind of have two seasons here. And there are opportunities in there where whether you're feeding for starvation, you're feeding for stimulation, or you're feeding for nutrition, there are different opportunities here that can really make a big difference in the timing of it in terms of your overall hive health and colony health. And again, I just encourage many of you, this is a prime opportunity. This webinar couldn't be more timed perfect. You have a golden opportunity here for the next month and a half to 2 months to really make such a big impact with not only mite reduction, but also stimulative or nutritional feeding. And again, I encourage many of you do it this year in your yards or in your hives and see what a profound difference that will make. So I'm just going to kind of quickly run through these. These slides are going to be made available by OSBA. So if you want to do a little more in-depth study on looking at some of these, please feel free. But I'm just going to go back to what I said here at the top. Understand these curves. And we seem to be surrounded by them again, right? They're always, today we live in a world of, are there curves? Are we bending the curve? Is the curve rising? Is the curve falling? And in our bee world, this is very much understand these curves, and it really gives you a sense. A couple of other quick takeaways before I wrap this up is for the summer dearth, it is always later than you think. I know many of you like me can't believe it's already approaching mid-July. And before you know it, it's going to be approaching fall. And it just will blink. We get distracted. It's the nature of time. Time itself doesn't seem to be linear anymore. I don't know what that is. Maybe that's an aging process. But again, develop a bee time sense. You know, if you've got a Fitbit on, if you've got an iWatch, if you've got something, set it ahead 3 months. That's where you should be working. You should be working 3 months from now. Other things, again, I just want to hammer down on, don't forget, inspections don't have to be, I mentioned the story earlier today to someone about a fellow who was making a bunch of splits right now. Hives are huge, happy, but he literally told me he was spending 90 minutes on a colony to try to find those queens and couldn't find them. And I quickly turned around and told him that all he had to basically do was using a queen excluder, create a hive sieve just to shake frames from above into an empty box below. And he could literally do, without having to find the queens, he could make these splits and be 100% assured that he was going where he wanted to go in 2 to 3 minutes. And so many things that we do as beekeepers, look to your mentors, look over shoulders. There are little tips and tricks out there that can make it much more enjoyable. I think I've beat you to death with feeding. It's important. I just can't hammer it enough. Summertime, the dearth, I don't know if I got cheeky here, it would be summer dearth in Latin means, you know, those who starve or lack of feeding. But it's so important that we recognize the critical value when they cannot bring in not just nectar, not just and make honey, but when there's no pollen, there are no vitamins, no minerals, no fats that they're bringing in. We start to raise malnourished bees in that colony. And then when we show up in the fall with basically fragile bees, they look like bees, but internally they just don't have the musculature development, the gut development. They just don't have the vitality and the rigor, the vigor, and the first stressors that come on for the fall. And particularly when we get into winter, whether it's a disease impact or even cold, it's kind of like they go into winter with a kind of walking pneumonia, and it all goes back to now. The feeding that does or doesn't happen now sets your bees and your colonies up for history. One of the other things that we have to recognize is that our bees get a lot of nutrition from themselves. You got to have a lot of young bees with hyperpharyngeal glands that produce a lot of royal jelly. And all bees, not queens that just live off of this, but all young eggs that then hatch into micro larvae have to be in a pool of royal jelly to start their first couple of days. And this has to come from the bees themselves. They're not putting honey or nectar down there. And so one of the great reasons here is you've got to feed your bees so that they can feed their bees. And that's a very important, if that link gets broken, then that breaks things down in the colony. And again, you can make bees, but they're going to be compromised at some level. I want to go off script here just a little bit and say, hooray, this is my glass not big enough. And my hat is still off to this young lady. I had the fortune of being the judge at the Ohio State Senior 4-H Fair last summer. And Ava showed up out of nowhere looking all just, well, you know, I have some hives. Okay, show me what you got. And the next thing she did is she literally was asking the question you're asking now. She started right now in the summer, and she fed her bees for 10 weeks with pollen supplements and had colonies that she did not. The question was there going to be any difference? Is it worth the expense? Is it worth the time and the energy to go into your colonies and manage these and feed your colonies? Long story short, when this was done, Ava proved, we knew the science, but Ava had the question. Ava proved that her colonies had about 20% more brood going into the fall than they, with pollen supplements that were put on in the summer, than those colonies that did not. And so once again, from the mouths of babes, what a wonderful little experiment, what proof to the fact, and I can tell you, there amongst beekeepers, we do know this. You have to have bees before we can even really talk about hive health and hive products and whatnot. The bigger the colony, the stronger the colonies. For some reasons we know and some reasons we don't know, stronger colonies, bigger colonies just seem to be more vibrant. They seem to be more disease resistant. They seem to have a lot more, they can take a lot more impacts from the environmental stressors that are around them. So I'm gonna just bounce over this because I know time is gonna be an issue here. But again, don't just think sugar water. The takeaway here is there's a lot of interesting things happening out there. Bees need a balanced diet, a varied diet in order to be healthy. So look at different types of sugars, but in particular, look at different types of protein that have all these other things in them, as I mentioned, vitamins, minerals, fats, and so forth. And then there are a lot of other things that people are asking about, no time here for, but there are probiotics and microbials that are out there that we're fascinated with, we've been experimenting with. We've seen no negative effects. We're trying to quantify the positive effects. But I like where this is going. If you were in any other animal husbandry business, and for those of you listening out there, I don't care if you're raising bunny rabbits or horses, cattle. If you're raising them, you have a nutrition program. You have a veterinary approved feed sources and so forth. You will not raise a feedlot, chickens, pigs, cattle, horse, without a very, very complex array of nutrition to get these animals through and keep them healthy and so forth. We've been a little behind the curve on that. We used to do nothing. Then it was sugar water. And then we would argue 1-to-1, 2-to-1, whatnot. Well, look at how far we've come. And I think there's a lot more room to grow here. So wrapping up, there's a lot of noise. I'm sure, and unfortunately, I didn't mean to scare any of you. But at the end of the day, I said 90% of beekeeping is just wash, rinse, repeat. But here's another way of saying that. With all the noise I just made, at the end of the day, there's just a handful, less than a handful of pests and disease that we can do anything about. And there's only a handful of treatments out there that we can legally apply to our colonies. So it's not as complex as you might think. It's just a few things that you have to get a grip on, how they work, when they work, where they work. And then at the end, monitoring has to be the ribbon that puts this all together. I think by now I don't have to convince you that there are a lot of great reasons for doing this. Save your bees, save money. And that's how I define real beekeeping. As the summer dearth ends, here's my picture that goes, if you've made it to fall and you want to know what a successful fall looks like, this picture right here. I should have blown this up on the other side. The bee gut, or the bee body, the abdomen on the left, is a classic bee going into fall. The one on the right is a fattened bee body. The takeaway here is that the way this phosphorus glows is the fats in the body are radiating. But look at the difference between the two of these. If you're going into a long, cold winter, where again, it's a surprise to people here, but we go 6 months without a nectar source in Ohio, in many regions, 6 months. And these bees have to not only have the food they have on site, but rely very healthily on the fats inside their bodies. And this is what you're going to be attempting to do now. If you can start building those fats now, so that they're fattened up and ready to go by fall, you're going to find out that you're going to have a much healthier colony, and you're going to have, again, productivity and lower mortality all around. I forgot I had this slide in here. Thank God it only says this. Last one's important. There was no time to get to that. I wish there was, but we had to do a little about a lot. As your queens may, I tend to think in queens as always failing. They're in some mode of failing, even if they're new. So if I have that mindset, rather than waiting for them to fail, or trying to talk myself out of their failing, this has to be a renewable resource. We get used to bees in the summer living for 6 weeks and only 6 months in the winter, but we tend to try to hang on to those queens. Or we tend to hang on to bad queens. And I can just assure you that good queens will produce good brood. And that's easy to say. There's a lot of complexity behind that. But always be working, always. It's kind of like the car sitting out there without an engine in it. Always be working to put a better engine in that car, because you can always make gradual improvements. So I think we're there, Jamie. Let's see if I can. If we have any time for Q&A. I don't know what time it is, so please.
Yeah, we got about 4 questions here.
Okay.
John asks, so the referral to the water option, how much less than 1-to-1 and for how long?
Yeah, I kind of hinted at that. I would literally keep water on throughout the summer. Put them you could put up, in jars on internal feeders. Many people do, and it's an extra box. You could literally put the plastic internal feeders on the inside. Just something that doesn't encourage robbing. But again, not 1-to-1, because again, what we suggest is happening there is the bees are basically thinking that they're robbing. And that's what starts to happen right about now. Strong colonies, lots of bees in the box, nothing's coming in. The foragers are still trained to be foragers. They're out looking, and when they don't find anything, first they're going to find your garage and any little honey that you have laying around. Then they're going to find the weakened colony next to them. Those of you who have seen weakened colonies lose 40, 50, 60 pounds of honey in a day or two, you come back and you went, what? You were going to extract, and you wonder where everything went. This is a good time on small colonies right now heading into the dearth. If you haven't extracted, put an entrance reducer in. Give those colonies a chance to fight for their lives, because the hoarding, the robbing is about to begin out there as we get into the dearth. But to the concentration levels, again, not 1-to-1, not 2-to-1. We're not trying to fatten up these colonies. We're trying to give them water. I mean, if they need sugars, yes. But we're trying to stimulate them, make them believe that there's a nectar flow on, and at the same time, give them the moisture that they're going to use in the colony instead of having to make the water runs. Again, to up hive humidity and keep the brood wet and the queen active and the colony productive. We think that a nectar flow is still going, and so life goes on. And as I said, take advantage of that. Once you see the bees working that well, if you want to pull another frame of foundation wax, if you want to do something, you can do that. You can't do that if there's not a nectar flow. It literally, many of you have you've got those boxes stand up, and all of a sudden when the nectar flow is over, they won't touch them. They'll walk all over them, they'll shred them, they won't touch them. You put a simulated nectar flow on them, you can get those bees to still draw out wax for the summer.
All right. Mike has a question about the same thing with the water, but do you leave the honey supers on at this time, or do you pull them so they don't try to store the mixture?
Yeah, that is, people get really nervous about whether or not you're making granulated sugar honey, and that could create a real issue. So I generally do it after I pull the honey. It just keeps things clear and simple. If I knew where I was going here, because they won't do that. I mean, they'll literally dry it down and they'll try to store it as honey, and that can create some issues with your customers and your ethics. So generally speaking, pull your honey. But again, and I don't know if I addressed that one as much either. When you're about to take your honey off and we're heading into the summer dearth, just ask yourself, what am I leaving? I mean, if you literally take every single frame of honey out there, your brood chambers, they didn't store a lot of honey in your brood chambers. They're still packing bees down there. You've got your honey supers on, and you literally take everything and you get fooled by the great green expanse. You think that the honey flows are still going to continue for another 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks. They're not, barring some anomaly out there. We're rapidly coming to the end of our honey season. And Ohio's big, so there are some of you who are shaking your head, and I can appreciate that. But monitor that when you take that honey off, you either have to leave enough to get them to the fall, or you have to accept the fact that you're going to supplement them. And if you're going to supplement them, remember, hives are at near peak populations. They need 100 pounds of honey a year to get a colony through. You'll be putting a lot of feed on. So the choice is up to you. And you'll also be giving them a substandard feed. Bees are much healthier on honey than they are on the sugars we provide them. So that's a choice you're going to have to make.
All right, we have a user that says, how do you feed sugar and pollen during the dearth in regards to robbing?
Well, one of them that I hinted at was the very first thing that I'll be very mindful of during the dearth is, again, entrance reducers. We tend to think about them only in the winter. And I think they have to be a standard practice in the summer going into the dearth, particularly smaller colonies. If you have your little nuke set up or a smaller weakened colony in particular, those are the ones that are ravaged first by the bigger marauding colonies. So protect them with an entrance reducer to give them a fighting chance. You're going to find out really quickly that even though there may be a reasonable number of bees in that box, the flights are going to drop precipitously, and that's your first real tell that the dearth is on. You can open up that box and you're going to see lots and lots of bees in there, but you're wondering what happened to those 200 and 300 flights a minute that I just saw a week or 2 or 3 ago. And those bees didn't die, but those kids are just sitting on the porch, not going anywhere. And again, I hate to say that using that metaphor, but that's usually a classic time for me when I know I've got a lot of bees and still young bees in the box. This is a perfect time for me to kind of exploit those resources. That's when I usually like to pull a frame out and stick a foundation frame in and let them get to draw a little bit of wax for me, because I have enough bees that are of the right age for their wax glands to be still producing, but they won't do it in the dearth unless you put some sugar water on. Light nectar, I shouldn't be calling it sugar water. It would probably be easier if I said nectar water. I need it at that concentration of only 10 to 15%. So again, the bees are thinking there's a flow on, so let's keep going.
All right. Laura asked, could you explain again about the queen excluder and shaking bees when doing a split?
Oh, sure. It's one of my favorites. I mean, ultimately, if you do a bunch of this, do yourself a favor and actually make yourself a funnel. Just buy a nice big Rubbermaid tub from somewhere that fits roughly the size of your brood chamber, and glue, cut the bottom out and glue your queen excluder into the bottom of that. So now you basically have this colander, this sieve. So think about this backwards. I want to make this split, but I got to find a queen, and I've got my other queen over here. So take your empty brood box that you're going to be putting things into. There are no bees in it. I've got, say, 4 frames in it, and set it down on a bottom board. Then on top of that, put your sieve box. Then go from the colony that you're looking to shake your bees into. So those are resources, prime resources that you're selecting a couple of frames that you're going to put into your split anyway, because it's got enough the right kinds of brood and age of brood in it. It's got some pollen in there. It's got some honey in there. But you're nervous about, if I can't find my queen in this big box of bees, how do I get these resources over there and put my new queen in without transferring that queen over or finding her? Well, don't worry about it. With your sieve, all you're going to do is say select those 4 or 5 frames that you're going to be putting into the other frames in the empty brood box below, and just shake those bees in there. What's going to happen is those bees instantly hitting that queen excluder are going to go down below. That's a natural stimulus response reaction. They're going to crawl down into the frames below. But one bee that can't make it through, well, the 2 are drones and the queen. So chances are, if you picked up your frames, if you're looking closely, you could probably find her. But if you don't even want to look, you can literally just, with comfort, shake those 4 frames into that sieve that you've made, and then look into the sieve, because the bees have climbed down into the lower box. If there's a queen in there, especially if she's marked, you're going to see her crawling around on that queen excluder, but you don't have to. Just pick up your sieve and dump that back into the colony that you were taking bees from. If there's anything in there, drones or a queen, that she's going to go right back into the old colony. Meanwhile, the frames that you had shuck, you can now just put in the box below. And again, you've spent no time looking for a queen, and you've guaranteed that you haven't put her in there. It saves you a lot of time, particularly if you're doing a bunch of these.
All right, a question from Amanda. Is there a pollen substitute that you prefer?
First of all, anything's better than nothing. That's how we start. And then my next level is, I want to go beyond protein. So the soy powders and so forth, again, that's better than the nothing. But if I can go there, and you all know what I mean, the bee catalogs are out there. You want to find a protein-rich but vitamin, mineral, fat fortified pollen substitute, because we need all of those to come to the party to give them a well-balanced diet. So I don't think I actually have to name, I could, but there are at least 2, 3 really great popular, and they're good. I won't tell you at this particular point. We've experimented with them all. And as a matter of fact, to be honest with you, like many beekeepers, commercial beekeepers, we have our own mix. We think we have a secret sauce that we're playing with all the time, that we try to adjust a little bit every year. We don't know that the other commercial people, they get themselves in a rut, in a mold, and we're wondering if a little bit of this or a little less of that would help. And the data is inconclusive. And I encourage making, to make bee feed at home. You'd be amazed how simple the ingredients and the recipes are. Some whey powder and some other things that you can find off the shelf. And I think we're going to see a lot more people willing to share and experiment. I think this is going to be one of those areas where crowdsourcing is going to really catch on. If I were to think, not in terms of just pest and disease control, we haven't done anything new. We need to do a lot more monitoring and a lot more measuring and testing. But the one thing that I could say that has really surprised me over the last 10 years has been the recognition of how vital nutrition is. And again, remember, I feed for 3 reasons. I feed for starvation, always number 1. Then I feed for stimulation. If I want to move my bees along, I want to get them to produce something, make something, that 10% solution. Or I feed for nutrition. I want to increase overall hive health. They're missing something from their diet, and I want to move them along. So when you feed and why you feed is important. But again, the capper being, I think not only has feed and feeding been one of the many unheralded revolutions in the beekeeping industry in the last 10 years, but I think there's so much more to come, and we need it. So I'm looking very forward to it.
All right, I'm going to launch a poll for OSBA, and then we're going to do one wrap-up question. This is between Jason, Galaxy Note, and Shirley. Everybody's asking, is it a 2-to-1, 3-to-1, or what kind of mix are you using to get that 10%?
Oh, it's neither. It's literally none of those. I do it by weight. So whatever container you want. I mean, it literally, think about how much water your container is, and then you want 10% of that to be sugar. So, and again, what we have found is the closer we are to 10%, the closer, and this is us, we're doing that anthropomorphizing. We're trying to think how bees think. So we think they think that, again, they're bringing in a nectar source. And when you look at the typical sucrose, fructose that's coming in, you can even play around with that with your sugars. If you're putting granulated sugars into your solution, you want to take it to the next level. There are sugars out there that are higher in fructose, higher in sucrose, and you can mimic and try to think about what type of, like many of us only sense the difference in sugars, let's say when our goldenrod honey solidifies in a bucket in a month and a half after we put it in, but our summer honeys hang around for months and months and months, and that's a fructose sucrose differential. And different flowers have different differentials, so you can even play around with those formulas. But a good way of doing it is by weight. You could play with the volume; it's a little trickier, but again, 10%. So
All right.
I mean,
And
yeah, it would be hard to measure, 1 cup of this in 100 cups of water. That's what we're striving for. So that's why if you just back of the envelope calculations, you did a little bit of math, you would find out that you can dial it in pretty quickly if you're just making a gallon or 2 or a 50-gallon pail. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but
okay. And Daniel's asking, feeding during the robbing season, does it reduce the amount of robbing?
Well, no, I am going to say that first of all, let's really be clear about this. This is one of those silent scourges that happens out there in the field. We really tend to think of our bees as benign, and they're not. These are the velociraptors, the flying sharks of the world. When they get hungry, they come in hordes, they come in masses. They're incredibly efficient about what they do. Just ask any other pollinator that lives around a beehive. When they're out scavenging 2 million flowers per pound, be a moth or a butterfly or another insect that happens to live in that ecosystem, and you're going to find out who's king of the roost. Second of all, again, back to protect those colonies that you are going to feed, because again, when you're using a light sugar syrup, it's not as big of a deal than using a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 sugars, because bees smell it, sense it at a much higher level. But whatever you do in terms of your internal feeding, and that's why I do like to go definitely inside, for sure, think about putting an entrance reducer on the front, and make sure that those back corners that have become compromised or whatnot, no, this is where duct tape or Gorilla Tape comes in handy. Do not leave these colonies vulnerable to any snips or holes, because again, as we come through this era, that's your job. And again, watch your colonies. If you see, particularly if you haven't put an entrance reducer on, you should see colonies that as the flight level activity goes nearly to 0 now, and you suddenly see a colony with lots of bees coming in and out. Those bees more than likely haven't found the secret gold stash of nectar somewhere in the far off valley somewhere. Those are robbers coming in to take over. And watch the front of the hive colony, you'll see very aggressive behavior. So intervene. Again, the perfect time to put in even if you have to remove feed for a couple of days to remove that stimulus, and you can go back to it, but put in an entrance reducer and make sure that feeding is all internal. Now, one way beyond that is you could stick external feeders out in your apiary or your bee yard, and far enough away being 30, 40, 50 yards from your colony, where, say, again, we like to use big Tupperware type containers with holes in the side and a lid on them. Then we'll throw in a bunch of straw, pour in a couple gallons of a concentrated syrup, or if we're really feeding for heavy, or a light syrup if we're feeding, but again, and that's a nice step, because again, the bees are flying out to it, they're bringing it in, and we think, again, they're mimicking what a nectar run typically is like. But one way of even avoiding some of that out there is to bring it internal. So the bees are literally not having to fly, and they get to feed 24/7. So you don't have to, you don't have a limited feeding option. You just have bigger bang for your buck.
All right, thank you. I went ahead and put the link on the group chat for Jim 2's presentation on Sunday, July 26th at 7 o'clock. You can RSVP for that. And one last question for you from Mike. Mr. Alex, do you put in honeybee healthy in the water mix?
You can. I haven't put it in the mix. As many of you are kind of trying to pull out of me, honeybee healthy is found in most of our pollen substitutes today for just that reason. It increases uptake. I haven't put it in the internal feeders because I found out that I haven't needed to. When they have access, they will take this. But you know what? Let me know. It can't. I don't think it can hurt. But again, you're just complicating the issue just a little bit. I don't necessarily see a particular downside to that, but I haven't done the experiments, so please send me a note. Let me know how it goes.
All right. There's no other questions. I want to thank everybody for spending their evening with us. Also, Mr. Zomchek for taking the time out, and I learned quite a bit tonight on the presentation, so everybody got something out of this. And thank you for taking the poll. Everybody agrees everything was right on spot. So thank you very much. Everybody have a good evening.
Yep.
And thank you for your time.
Thank you, everyone.